In this video, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about Socket.io, from the basics of sending messages between people, joining different rooms, and also more complex things such as this entire admin dashboard, how to deal with namespaces, middleware, authentication, and so much more. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now, to get started with this project, I have a little bit of boilerplate code set up. As you can see, I have a bunch of different styles inside of here. I also have some just basic HTML to get the page that you can see on the right-hand side of our screen. And I also, inside of our script, just have a few basic things set up. I'm selecting our form, our room input, our message input, and our room button, just all the components down here. And I have an event listener, so whenever we submit our form, as you can see, it's getting our message and room values. If we don't have a message, it's doing nothing. Otherwise, we're going to call this display message function with our message and then clear out an input. So if I type in a message, click send, you can see it just displays that message up here. That's all this display message function is doing. And then finally, we have this join room button event listener. So when we click on our join room button down here, it's going to call this function and just get that room value. Just some boilerplate code out of the way. And I'm running this using Snowpack. So as you can see, I have Snowpack as a dev dependency, and I'm just running Snowpack dev. So we have this server set up on the side here. None of that really matters too much though, since this entire video is really focused on Socket.io. Also, I have a server folder here. This server.js is empty. And in our package.json, we're just running nodemon with that server file so that every time we make changes, it auto refreshes. So if I just open up a terminal and I go into that server folder, and I just run npm run dev start, that is going to start up and run our file. And then every time we make changes inside of that server.js, such as console.log I, as you can see, those changes are automatically refreshing for us. So now in order to get started with Socket.io, we first need to understand exactly what Socket.io is doing. And all it's doing is allowing us to make a connection between a client and a server, but have that connection persist. So normally when you need to make, for example, a fetch request or some type of AJAX request, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, server, give me information. So you're asking some server for some information. So you're going to be pointing to the server, and then the server is going to give that information back to the client when you use something like fetch or AJAX. And that's the end of the request. So you do a fetch, it gets to the server, gets to the client, and then the information closes off. But if you need to make, for example, 10 different fetch requests, well, you need to make 10 new requests to the server. So you're going to do this, 10 different times. With Socket.io, it's a bit different. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be setting up something called a WebSocket. And these WebSockets are going to connect to the server, but that connection stays open. So if I make 10 requests to the server through my WebSocket, I only ever make one connection to the server because that connection stays open. This is really useful when you need to make a lot of requests, especially if they're smaller requests, because you can just constantly talk with the server without having to worry about the headache of setting up a connection and then tearing down the connection, because those things do take time. And when all you're doing is communicating a lot of small things to the server, that extra time of setting up and closing down that connection are going to really add up, which is where WebSockets are really useful. So things like chat applications, which is what we're going to work towards in this video, are really ideal for WebSockets. So in order to get this set up, we first need to have a server, which is what we're going to communicate to, and then we need a client that is going to connect to that server. I'm going to get started by setting up the server because it's fairly straightforward. All we need to do is come in here and npm I our socket.io library. This is just going to make doing that WebSocket stuff so much easier. Now let's start our server back up. And to deal with this socket.io library, we're going to require socket.io, and this is actually a function. And we're just going to call this function and pass it in the port of our server. So we're going to say port 3000 is where Socket.io is going to run. So now we can just come in here and say that's going to be equal to a variable called io. And then what we can do is say that io.on, and we're going to say on connection. And what this is going to do is it's going to be a function that runs every single time a client connects to our server, and it's going to give a socket instance for each one of them. And for now, I'm just going to say console.log of our socket.id, which is just a random ID assigned to each person when they connect to our server. This is all it takes really to set up a server with Socket.io. So the server side of things is done. We can move over to the client side of things, and we need to install a library down here. So we can say npm I socket.io -client. This is going to be the client version of the library that we're going to be using. And let's start that server back up. So now instead of our script, we're just going to say that we're going to import io. We're going to get that from that socket.io client. And this io is just a function that we can call to get an individual socket. So let's come down here. We're going to say that our socket is going to be equal to calling io. And here you need to pass it the URL of our server. Well, our server we know is on HTTP, localhost, and we gave it the port of 3000. So now this is going to connect us to our server. And now if we save this and we go over to our server here, once everything refreshes and gets running, we should hopefully see that we're able to connect to the server. And inside of here, we should be logging out that ID. But that's not happening, as you can see. So if we inspect our page, you're going to notice an interesting error that shows up. And if we just refresh this to make sure the error shows up, you can see that we're getting a bunch of errors and it's all saying cores. We're all being blocked by cores. Well, with Socket.io, right now we're on port 8080 for our client and our server's on port 3000. And these two things cannot communicate to each other because cores is blocking them. And if you're not really familiar with cores, I have a whole video on it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But Socket.io makes dealing with cores really easy. All we do is pass in an options parameter to this function. And in here, we just say cores. And for cores, all we need to do is say that our origin is going to be equal to an array of origins. And we just pass in wherever our client is. So our client we know is localhost 8080. So we just have an array and it's saying localhost 8080 is where our client lives. Now when we save and we wait a second, you can see our IDs are being printed out down here, one for each one of our different clients. And if we inspect, we should hopefully have no errors inside of here. If we just close this out, there'll be no new errors that come up. Those are just old errors from before. But as you can see, we now have two different connections, one for each one of our browsers. And that's because every time someone connects to our website, they're going to get this connection made. So any computer anywhere connecting to our site is going to go through this io.on connection. And that's purely because in our script here, we're creating a new socket. Now, the important thing about Socket.io is the communication between the server and client. Right now, we created a connection between the server and client. And in order to check that connection, what we can do is we can just say socket.on, and this is going to listen to any event. We can create our own custom events, or we can use an event such as connect, which is an event that'll run every time we connect to our server. And inside of here, what we want to do is we just want to print something out. We're going to display a message to the screen that says, you connected with ID, and let's just print out their ID, which is socket.id. Make sure that this is a $sign up here. And now when we save, you can see immediately when we connect, it's saying you connected with ID, and it's printing out the ID of the socket that we connected to the server with. So now we can set up a connection to the client and server. We can listen to events coming down from the server, but how do we send events up from the client to the server? Well, this is where we can do something called socket.emit. Emit is just going to take any event that you want and send it to the server. So we can name the event anything we want. Let's just say custom event. Doesn't matter what the name is. And we can pass it any information we want. You know, I could pass it 10, I could pass it hi, I could pass it in here an object that says A is equal to, you know, let's say A right here. I could pass it as much or as little information as I want. It really doesn't matter. And what's going to happen is it's going to call this on my server. So in the server, we want to listen for this custom event. So in the server, we can just say socket.on. So whenever a socket listens and hears this custom event, it's going to call a function. And that function is going to have all of these different parameters. So we know that we have a number, a string, and an object. Those are three different parameters we're passing up. And let's just for now console log our number, our string, and our object to see if this is working as expected. So if we save both of these, we should hopefully send this custom event up as soon as we connect. And as you can see, we're sending that up immediately. It's saying 10 hi, and then it's passing out that object, and the same thing right here. Now, sometimes you may notice that if we save this, this actually doesn't get sent up, and that's because we actually don't connect in time. So you may need to put this inside of your onConnect to make sure you're always connected before you try to send these events. Now, this is a great way to actually send events, but this event right here is pretty useless. So let's send an event anytime we try to send a message. Inside of here, when I send a message, I want to say socket.emit send message. And inside of here, I just want to pass it up the message we're sending. So now if I go up into our server, we can listen for that send message function, and it's going to take in a message, and then we can console log that message. So now whenever I type in a message and hit send, you can see that message is being sent up to the server. And it doesn't matter which browser I do this in. All of them are connected, so every single one is going to send up the message to the server. Now what we can do is actually send this message down to all of our different clients. So let's just refresh both these pages so we have a blank screen to work with. And what I want to do inside of here is I want to send this message down to our client. So what we can do is just say io.emit, and this is going to emit a message. And we can say whatever we want. We can call this receive message. We could call it send message again. It really doesn't matter what the name is. You can make whatever you want. And we're going to pass down this message. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell our server to send a message to every single socket out there, all of our different clients. So now inside of our client, we can listen for that. We can say socket.on, receive message. It's going to take in a message, and let's just display that message out to the user. So now if we type in a message, we'll just say hi from me and click send. You can see it said hi from me, and then our other socket also received this message. But you'll notice this socket also received the same message. So it printed out once because we called a display message here, and it printed out a second time because it also got receive message here. So when you do io.emit, it sends a request to all of the different clients, including the client that actually made the request in the first place. If you only want to send a message or an event down to all the clients except for the client that sent the message, well, then what you do is you say socket.broadcast and then .emit. What this is saying is, okay, I want to take our current socket, and from that socket, I want to broadcast a message to every other socket that isn't me, and that message is this. So now if we save this, let's just refresh both these pages here, and I'm going to send hi from me. You'll now notice it gets sent to both users, but it doesn't actually get sent to this first user, and that's because we're already displaying the message here, and it's not ever receiving the message up here. We're only sending it to every other user except for the one that we currently are. That's what this broadcast flag is going to do. Super useful in scenarios like this. Now this right here is essentially the most basic form of socket.io. We can send and receive events from the client to the server and from the server to the client, and we can choose which sockets we're going to be sending those to, whether we're going to send it to all the sockets or every socket except for ourselves. But what happens if we want to be able to have private rooms where we only communicate with certain people, or we join a room and then we only get messages inside of that room? Well, that's a thing that we can do inside of socket.io. By default, every single user in socket.io has their own room, and that's just their ID right here. So this user is currently in a room with themselves with this ID. So if I want to send a message to another user, I can send it to a room that is their ID. So let's do that real quick. What I want to do is I want to send a message, and I want to pass up the room property. So whatever we type in here is going to be our room variable, and I'm also going to pass up the message. Then inside of our server, we're going to take in that message and the room. And I just want to do a quick check to see if our room is equal to nothing. Well, then we don't have a room, so we're just going to broadcast this to everyone. Otherwise, if we do have a room, we want to send our message specifically to that room. So we can say socket.toRoom. And this room is just a unique name. It can be whatever you want it to be. It's just going to be a room, and everyone that's currently in that room is going to get the message. And then we can just copy the rest of this emit part right here. So we're going to emit a message to this room from this socket. And the nice thing about using .to is it already does this broadcast portion. So this .broadcast is assumed when you're sending a message to a room, it sends it to everyone except for yourself. So now what we can do is we can come in here, just refresh. We can say this is a message to all, and we click send, and you can see that message gets sent to everyone. But what if I want to send a message to just this user right here? Well, let's just come in here. I'm going to open up a new tab, and this tab is a brand new user, and I want to send a message only to this user. Well, I can say this is private, and I can paste in the room that I want to send that to. And remember, I said every socket is in a room that is the same as their ID. So this socket has a room that starts with UPT. This one has that _5 room. So when I click send, I sent this private message to this user. It shows up here just because inside of our script.js, we're always displaying a message when we send it. But this new user over here didn't get the private message. But if I send a public message, for example, I say this is public, you can see this person got it, and this new person also got that message. So I'm able to send private messages or public messages based on this room ID. And this ID is just the ID of the socket itself. So that's really good for sending one-on-one types of messages. But what happens if you want to send a message to multiple people, but not to everyone? This is where the idea of custom rooms come in. Inside of our code here, we have this join room button, and we want to take in the room and we want to join that room. Well, we can't join a room from the client. We need to tell the server we're going to be joining a room. So I'm going to say socket emit, and I'm going to send up a message that's just called join room. And this join room is going to take in the room that we want to join. And this is going to join me to that room. So in the server, let's set up a listener for that. We can say socket.on join room. We're going to take in a room. And what I want to do is actually join the user to this room. And this is actually really easy to do in socket.io. We just say socket.join, and we pass it in the room we want to join. And this will join a room with this custom name. So now what I can do, just refresh both these users here, get rid of this extra one. And what we want to do is we're going to say that we're going to join the room test for this user, click join. Down here, we're going to join the room test as well. Or actually, let's not join the room test yet. We're just going to send our message up here, and you notice it doesn't send to the user down here. But if we join that test room, now they're both in the same room. So when we click send, it's going to send that message to both users in that room. And that's because whenever we have a room typed in down here, it's going to send a message to that room. And since both these users are in the test room, it's going to send that message to them. But if we were to send a message, for example, to test 3, this user is not in test 3 down here. So when we send a message, it doesn't go to the user. But if we join test 3 and then send the message, it now gets sent to both users. And the nice thing about rooms is you can join as many rooms as you want. For example, this user is still in this room right here, which is their ID. And they're still in that original test room. They're in all of the different rooms that they joined up to this point. So rooms are really good for being able to segment different users. You can think, for example, like a group chat would be great for having rooms, or if you have like a game that you're creating, each lobby is going to be its own particular room. But one additional thing that you can do with these events of socket on and socket emit is you can actually pass it up a callback function. And this callback function is going to get called from the server back down to the client. So let's pass this a callback, which is going to take in a message. And all I want to do is display that message. So we can just say display message of that message. This is our callback function. And this callback function we get on the server. So here we're going to have our room, and we're also going to have this callback. And the callback must always be the last thing you pass to a .emit. And then what we can do is we can just call that callback with a message. For example, we can say joined, and then we can pass it in the name of the room that they joined. So now what we're doing is inside of our socket on, we're joining them to that room, and then we're calling this callback. And this callback is really cool because you can't call code from the client when you're in the server, and you can't call code in the server when you're on the client. But with this callback, it allows you to essentially do that because behind the scenes, it's doing a WebSocket connection to make this work. So what's happening is we're passing up this function saying, hey, you know what? Call this function with a result whenever we call our join room here. And so we're saying, okay, we're calling that function and we're passing it down this message. So now when I type in a room here and click join, it gives us back that joined with the name here. So it's calling the callback with this string and passing it down to this callback right here. This is a really cool thing inside of Socket.io because if you just want to do something and then tell the user that that thing was successful, for example, join in a room, this is a great use case for this. Another place this is great is if you wanted to have a messaging system where you would tell the user once the message was sent. Well, this callback could be used to verify that the message was sent, because sometimes you may send off a socket request and it takes a long time for it to process. The internet connection's slow or the server's backed up, so it's going to take a long time to process. So being able to have the feedback from the user saying, you know what, here's the callback, your message was successful, is really useful. Now that right there is the bulk of Socket.io, but there's a bunch of additional more niche features that I really want to show you. So the first one is going to be an admin UI. So what we need to do is we need to npm I the @socket.io/admin UI library. And this is going to give you a super nice dashboard that you can use to view Socket.io stuff. Now, once that's done, we can restart our dev server. And at the top, I want to be able to import that. So we can say const instrument, which is the function that we want to get, is going to come from requiring that Socket.io/admin UI. And then we just need to call this instrument function, instrument. And we need to pass it in the instance of our IO. And then we're just going to say auth is false, because for now, we don't really care about authentication to get into this dashboard. Obviously, you're going to want to set auth to some type of username password, but for our use case, this is just temporary. We don't really care about that. Now, once you've done that, what you need to do is you need to go to this admin.socket.io website. And this is essentially going to allow you to log in with that server URL, which in our case is http://localhost 3000, and then just add /admin to the end of it. And if we have a username password, this is where you would enter it. Since we don't, we're just going to click connect. Now you'll notice when we click connect, we're getting an error, and that's because we need to take this URL, which is just admin.socket.io, and we need to add that to our core's origin list. So let's add that into our list here. And now when we try to do our connect, you're going to notice we successfully connect. And if I just make this dashboard a little bigger so we can see what's going on, in our dashboard, we can see all the different web sockets we have connected, which in our case is 3 sockets. 2 of them are because of the web browsers that we have right here. And the third one is one that's connected on this admin namespace. And that's because in order to build out this dashboard, Socket.io just uses a socket connection. So that's where this one socket comes from. Also, you can see we have one server because we only have one server running. Let's throw this into dark mode. We can view each one of our sockets here, and we can view some pretty in-depth detail about all of our different sockets, such as the rooms that they're in. We can see the namespaces that they're a part of, which is something we're going to cover in a little bit. You can also see all of the different rooms that are available. So if we decide to create a room called test and join that room, you can now see we have that test room with one socket. If we join it with our other user and click join, If I actually spell test properly, you can now see there are 2 sockets inside that test room. We can see each one of our clients, our servers. We can see a ton of different information on this dashboard. So it's super useful, and I highly recommend that you use this. Now you notice I talked a little bit about namespaces, how we're in our root namespace and this is our admin namespace. Well, we can actually create our own custom namespaces if we want. So in order to do that, let's just close out of this admin UI, go over to our server, and what we want to do is just set up a separate IO instance, which is just going to be user IO, and we just say io.of, and we pass it in the path to our thing, which is going to be /user in our case. We're creating a user namespace, we're just calling it user IO, and all we do is say io.of to get to that namespace. And then everything we do on our normal IO, we can do on this user IO. So we can say user IO.on connection. I'm going to get in a socket, and I'm just going to come in here and say console.log connected to user namespace, just like that. So now in order to connect to this user namespace, what we need to do inside of our client is make a connection to it. So we can create a user socket here, and all we need to do is connect to our URL, just add the namespace to the end, which is /user in our case. And now you can see we're printing out connected to user namespace in our console here, and that's because on our server, we're making that connection. Now I'm going to be honest, namespaces aren't something I use super often, but if you wanted to have such as like an admin namespace that requires different credentials and authentication, it's really easy to do with namespaces because you can actually connect middleware. And you can connect middleware to anything such as our base IO or our namespaces, but it's really useful for connecting like authentication middleware to this thing right here. So let's just come in here and we're going to say user IO.use, and this is how we set up different middleware. And every middleware is going to take a socket and it's going to take a next function. So this socket is just going to be all the information for the socket we're connecting with, and next is just going to be the next middleware. If we call next, that means we successfully move on to the next middleware. And if we call next with an error, then that means that we had some type of problem, and it's going to tell that user the problem we had. So what I want to do here is get authentication information. And when you connect to a socket right here, you can pass in auth information. For us, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a token. So we're just going to say token is just going to say test. That's our token name. So we're passing in an auth token of the name of test up to our user socket. And inside of here, we can access that by saying socket.handshake. And then we can access anything inside of auth. So we can say auth.token. So what I want to do is say if we have a token, then what I want to do is I want to take our socket.username and I want to set it equal to, getting our username from the token. Imagine that you have an actual token. You can get the username from that token, and let's just pass it in the token that we have. So for our use case, we're just going to create that function real quick, get username from token, takes in a token, and for us, it's just going to return the token, but you could, access a database, whatever you need to do to get the actual user information from that token. Then we can call next. Otherwise, if we didn't pass up a token, what I want to do is call next. This time I'm going to pass it in a new error. And this error will just say, please send token, just saying that you didn't send us a token. So now when I save this, what I want to do up here is I want to say connected to user namespace with username, and I'm going to pass in socket.username. So now you can see it says connected to user namespace with username test, which is the token we sent up. So since we're setting our username on our socket, we can actually access that inside of here. So this is the perfect way to authenticate users. You can check, are they authenticated? If so, then this, we're going to get our user and call next, otherwise throw an error. And the nice thing about this is it's only on our user instance of our IO because we're setting up the middleware on this user IO namespace. While our normal namespace, you see we don't pass any authentication to it, but it still works just fine. And that's because we're not running this middleware on our normal IO. We're only running it on this small namespace right here. Now, if for some reason we had an error with the connection, for example, we didn't pass up any authentication information like this, well, then what we need to do is we need to be able to check to make sure we didn't pass up any information. And to do that, we can just say user socket.on connect _error. This is going to pass us down an error message. And all I want to do is just say display message of error to see what this is. And if we save, you can see we get error, please send token, which is the error we put right here. So we can easily send down errors to the client if for some reason they didn't have the authentication information that we need. But if we were to pass in the authentication information again, so I just say auth and I say token, it will just say it's equal to A. Now you can see we don't get any errors and it says we connected with the username A. And the last thing that I want to cover in this Socket.io tutorial is how Socket.io actually handles disconnecting and reconnecting. So let's just come in here and set up a really quick add event listener on our document for whenever we press a key down. And what I want to do simply inside of here is just make sure that we're not inside of an input. So we'll just say if e.target.matches, matches input, then we're going to return. Otherwise, if we press the key C, then what I want to do is connect. So we'll say socket.connect. Otherwise, if I press the key D, then what I want to do is disconnect my socket. So this is just allowing me to really easily connect or disconnect from the socket connection. And then I'm going to set up an interval. And inside this interval, all I want to do is send the same message over and over again. So we're going to say let count equals 0. And I just want to essentially ping the server. So I can say socket.emit ping. And we're just going to add up our count here. So I'm just going to be pinging this every 1 second, and it's going to be adding 1 to our count every single time. Then in our server, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say socket.on ping. It's going to take in a number, and I just want to console.log that number. So now what we should do is see our number being counted up a little bit. And what I want to do is just make sure that we only have one of these clients running at a time so we can really easily see what's going on. As you can see, we're just counting up 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect. So I'm going to click D and I'm going to disconnect. And you're going to notice we get no more messages being sent. And now, since I've waited a while, when I reconnect, you're going to notice all of our messages get sent that have been queued up. So we stopped at 7, and then immediately it's sent to 8, 9, 10, all the way up to like 15 or 16, wherever we were currently at. So by default, Socket.io, when you disconnect, will store all of the messages that you send, and then once you reconnect, it'll send them all at once. If you don't want to do this, what you can do is you can use the volatile flag. So I can say .volatile, and then what this is saying is if I can't send the message, just forget about it completely. So let me save, reset us back to our count to 1, and disconnect. I'm going to disconnect for a little while, and then when I reconnect, you'll notice it just starts us at our count wherever we were. It doesn't resend all the previous messages, it just ignores them all. That's what volatile does. It just says if it can't send the message, delete it, and if we don't use volatile, it'll continually try to resend the message until you reconnect. Now I know this is a lot to cover, but I have tons of Socket.io tutorials that cover these concepts in great depth. You can find them over here, so make sure you check those out if you want to learn even more about Socket.io.